The morning sun spilled a golden warmth over the city, its rays piercing through the towering windows of the courthouse, casting long, radiant beams across the polished marble floors. It was a deceptively serene day, the kind where the world outside hummed along at its usual rhythm, blissfully unaware of the tempest simmering within these walls. Judge Ayanna Johnson strode through the grand halls with a deliberate grace, her heels clicking sharply against the pristine stone, her black robe swaying gently with each purposeful step. At 43, she carried herself with an authority forged through decades of relentless determination, a presence that demanded respect, earned through years of navigating a system that had never been crafted with her in mind. She was a black woman who had clawed her way to this bench, facing more trials, delivering more verdicts, and weathering more resistance than most judges twice her age could claim. Her reputation preceded her, fair yet resolute, compassionate yet unshakable, a guardian of justice who refused to let bias, corruption, or fear taint the law she swore to uphold. Ayanna had presided over cases that made headlines, handed down rulings that toppled men who thought themselves untouchable, and faced the quiet backlash that came with it. The whispers in the corridors, the veiled threats slipped into casual remarks, the subtle reminders that she remained an outsider in a world not built for her triumph. She had grown accustomed to the sidelong glances, the patronizing tones, the thinly masked contempt from certain officers who bristled at the idea of her authority over them. Her skin had thickened against it all, her resolve hardened by the knowledge that justice wasn't just a job. It was her calling, her fight. But today, as she approached her courtroom, a familiar unease prickled at the back of her neck, a premonition she couldn't quite shake. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension, a suffocating weight that pressed down on every soul present. Lawyers fidgeted with their pens, witnesses shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and spectators held their breaths, sensing the unraveling of something raw and wrong. At the center of it all stood Officer Daniel Bridges, his voice slicing through the stillness like a jagged knife. "You think you're in charge here? You think that little robe gives you power over me?" His words dripped with arrogance, each syllable a taunt, a challenge flung into the face of order. He was a towering figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that intimidated most into silence. To the public, he was a hero. 15 years on the force, a decorated cop who'd walked through the grit of the streets and emerged a legend. But Ayanna saw through the myth. She knew the buried reports, the complaints hushed up, the pattern of excessive force that shadowed his record, especially against young black men who, in his eyes, always seemed to resist a little too much. Bridges had always walked away unscathed, shielded by a brotherhood that bent the rules to protect its own. Today, though, that shield was fraying. The case was straightforward on paper: a 26-year-old black man, unarmed, beaten senseless during a routine traffic stop. Bridges had been the one to deliver the blows, to press his knee into the man's neck until his body went limp. The victim had survived, barely, and this time, the truth couldn't be buried. A bystander's video had captured it all, raw and undeniable, a window into a reality too long ignored. Now Bridges stood before Ayanna, summoned to answer for his actions, yet he carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed consequences were for others. Ayanna's dark eyes narrowed as she stared him down from the bench, her voice steady but edged with steel. "Officer, you are out of line. This is my courtroom. If you persist with this behavior, I will have you removed." Her words were a command, not a request, rooted in the authority she'd fought a lifetime to wield. But Bridges only laughed, a dry, hollow sound that sent a shiver through the room, a laugh devoid of humor and heavy with menace. "Removed? You'll have me removed, lady? You don't get it, do you? This world doesn't spin the way you think it does. I'm done taking orders from people like you." His tone was a venomous jab, the "people like you" hanging in the air like a loaded gun, aimed not just at her, but at everything she represented. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a wave breaking on a jagged shore. People shifted in their seats, some fumbling for their phones, instinctively knowing they were witnessing a moment teetering on the edge of disaster. Bridges took a step forward, his heavy boots thudding against the gleaming floor, the sound reverberating through the taut silence. His hand drifted to his hip, a casual yet deliberate move that set Ayana's nerves alight. "I will not warn you again," she said, her voice rising, firm and unyielding. "Stand down." But he didn't. In one fluid, defiant motion, he drew his taser, the device crackling to life with a blinding flash of electricity. The air split with a violent snap as 50,000 volts surged toward her. Ayana's body seized mid-breath, her knees buckling as she crumpled to the floor, her robe twisting around her like a fallen banner. Papers fluttered from the bench, scattering in a chaotic dance as her frame convulsed against the wood. The courtroom erupted. Gasps morphed into screams. A chair scraped harshly as the bailiff lunged forward, his hand on his holster. Lawyers shouted over one another, their voices a frantic cacophony, but Bridges stood unmoved, a smirk curling his lips as he watched Ayana writhe in agony on the floor of her own domain. "You see that?" he bellowed, his voice booming over the pandemonium, thick with a cruel triumph. "That's what happens when you forget your place." His eyes gleamed with a sick satisfaction, as if he'd just taught a lesson to a disobedient child rather than assaulted a judge in the heart of her court. When the taser's hum finally died, Ayana's body slumped against the floor, her breaths ragged and shuddering, her fingers twitching as though still wrestling with the phantom currents that had torn through her. Pain seared her every nerve, humiliation burned in her chest, but her mind remained a fortress, sharp, unbroken. Even in that moment of raw vulnerability, she knew this wasn't the end. This was a beginning, a spark that would ignite something far greater than his arrogance could contain. Chaos swallowed the room. The bailiff, a wiry man named Marcus with a decade of service under his belt, had his gun drawn now, his hands trembling not from fear, but from a fury he could barely contain. He'd always admired Ayana, seen her as a beacon in a system too often dimmed by compromise. Now, his voice cracked as he shouted, "Drop it! Drop it now!" But Bridges didn't flinch, his hands resting casually on his belt, his posture radiating a chilling confidence. The lawyers, usually so composed, were a mess of overlapping yells, one demanding an arrest, another pleading for calm, their briefcases forgotten as they grappled with the surreal horror unfolding before them. Spectators pressed against the pews, some crying, others filming, their shaky footage destined to become the match that lit a firestorm. Bridges didn't run. He didn't even look worried. He stood there basking in his defiance, certain that the system would bend to shield him as it always had. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed he might be right. The next hours blurred into a haze of reports, witness statements, and the police department's frantic scramble to smother the fallout. They placed him on administrative leave, a feeble gesture, a tap on the wrist for a man who'd just electrocuted a judge in open court. No charges, no cuffs, no reckoning. The nation watched, breathless, waiting for justice that didn't come. Then the video hit the internet. A spectator's recording, grainy but unmistakable, spread like wildfire across screens worldwide. Millions saw it. The crackle of the taser, the judge's body crumpling, the officer's smirk stretching wide as he loomed over her. Rage ignited, raw and uncontainable. News stations looped the clip relentlessly, each replay stoking the public's fury. Protests erupted, streets flooding with voices demanding accountability, their signs bearing Ayana's name alongside calls for an end to the impunity that shielded men like Bridges. Yet still, he remained untouched, a ghost slipping through the cracks of a system he knew too well. But justice, like karma, doesn't announce its arrival. It came for Bridges not with fanfare, but with a quiet, devastating force no one could have predicted. Days later, as the country held its breath, something shifted. Something beyond the courts, beyond the protests, something that struck deeper than any verdict could. What happened to him wasn't just punishment. It was a reckoning, a twist so profound it left the nation stunned into silence. Ayana, Rising from her hospital bed, her body bruised but her spirit unbroken, watched it unfold with a quiet satisfaction. She had always believed in the law, in its power to right wrongs, but this was a lesson in consequences, a reminder that abusing power carries a price, one that no badge could deflect. In the aftermath, the story became more than a courtroom clash. It was a mirror held up to a society wrestling with its flaws, a testament to resilience, and a warning that justice, though delayed, could strike with a force that shook the world. For Ayanna, for Marcus, for the millions who'd watched in horror and hope, it was proof that no one, not even a man like Bridges, could dim the light of those who refused to be silenced. The courtroom buzzed with a tense electric hum as Daniel Bridges slouched in his chair, his posture radiating an unshakable confidence that bordered on insolence. His broad shoulders relaxed against the wooden backrest, and a faint smirk played at the edges of his lips, tugging them upward as though he were mildly amused by the unfolding scene. To him, this was nothing more than a fleeting annoyance, a trivial bump on the road to his inevitable freedom. A freedom he'd tasted time and time again, slipping through the cracks of a system that seemed tailored to shield men like him. His sharp blue eyes glinted with a quiet defiance, scanning the room as if he owned every inch of it, every person in it. Across the room, Judge Ayanna Johnson settled into her seat behind the bench, her dark robes settling around her like a mantle of authority. Her presence commanded silence, her steady gaze cutting through the air like a blade. It was a look that had unraveled weaker men, reducing them to stammering apologies, but Bridges met it with that same infuriating smirk. As the proceedings kicked off, the attorneys launched into their opening statements, their voices rising and falling in a practiced rhythm. The prosecution laid out its case with precision, unveiling evidence piece by meticulous piece. Documents, timestamps, witness accounts, all building toward the moment everyone knew was coming. Then the screen flickered to life, and the video began to roll. The footage was raw, unfiltered, and utterly damning. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the images played out, a scene so brutal, so visceral, that it seemed to suck the air from the space. Spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some covering their mouths, others whispering in hushed, horrified tones. The violence captured on that grainy tape wasn't just an act. It was a statement, a glaring testament to unchecked power. And yet, there Bridges sat, his expression unchanged, his body still loose and untroubled. No flinch, no flicker of guilt, just that smirk, etched deeper now, as if he were watching a mildly entertaining rerun. The prosecution pressed forward, their final argument slicing through the room like a thunderclap. They demanded accountability, their voices trembling with righteous fury. They insisted that the badge pinned to Bridges' chest, a symbol he'd worn like armor, should no longer be a free pass, a golden ticket to evade the consequences of his actions. For the first time, Bridges stirred. He leaned forward, elbows resting casually on the table, his voice sliding out low and smooth, laced with something dangerously close to amusement. "You're wasting your time, you know that, right?" His words weren't for the attorney pacing before him. They were aimed squarely at Ayanna, his eyes locking onto hers with a chilling intensity. This wasn't just a trial to him, it was a personal showdown, a test of wills. Ayanna's jaw tightened, but she didn't waver. "Officer Bridges," she said, her tone sharp and measured, "you will address this court with the respect it deserves." A low chuckle rumbled from his chest, his head tilting slightly as if she'd told a joke. "Respect? That's funny. You know, Judge, you strut around up there like you own the place. Like any of this actually matters." His voice dripped with mockery, each syllable a deliberate jab. A murmur spread through the courtroom like wildfire, nervous energy crackling among the onlookers. The prosecution snapped an objection, their words sharp and indignant. Bridges' own defense attorney shrank in his seat, his face paling as if he wished the floor would swallow him whole. The bailiff, a burly man with a stern jaw, took a cautious step closer, his hand hovering near his holster. But Bridges wasn't finished. He straightened, his broad frame looming larger as he shook his head with a sharp, dismissive exhale. You sit up there in your little robe, thinking you've got power, thinking you can tell men like me what to do. You don't get it, do you? You never have. His words hung heavy, a challenge wrapped in contempt. Ayana's fingers curled tighter around the gavel, her knuckles whitening. Her pulse thrummed steady and strong, a quiet anchor against the storm of rage swelling in her chest.
"Officer Bridges," she warned, her voice cutting through the tension. "You are out of line. If you continue, I will hold you in contempt."
That smile crept back onto his face. Not a warm one, not a genuine one, but something twisted, something that made her stomach churn. It was the smile of a man who'd already decided the rules didn't apply to him, a man who refused to let anyone, least of all a black woman, claim the upper hand. Then, in a heartbeat, everything shifted. Before the bailiff could close the distance, before anyone could register the glint of metal in his hand, before Ayana's fingers could brush the emergency button hidden beneath her bench, Bridges moved. His hand darted to his belt, and with a fluid, practiced motion, he yanked the taser free. The next moments dissolved into chaos. A blinding flash of electricity split the air, followed by the sickening crackle of voltage tearing through flesh. Ayana's body seized, a sharp, involuntary gasp escaping her lips as the current slammed into her. Her muscles locked, her limbs betraying her as 50,000 volts stole every shred of control. The gavel slipped from her hand, clattering against the wood with a hollow thud. Her vision blurred, the edges darkening as her mind scrambled to process the impossible. She was being attacked, right there in her own courtroom, in front of dozens of witnesses frozen in stunned silence. Then the darkness swallowed her whole. When awareness trickled back, the room had erupted. Shouts bounced off the walls, a cacophony of panic and outrage. Someone, maybe the bailiff, maybe a deputy, wrestled Bridges' arms behind his back, his smirk still intact even as they pinned him down. The bailiff's voice boomed, hoarse and frantic, barking for backup as he struggled to regain order. Ayana's fingers twitched against the bench, the residual shocks still sparking through her nerves, leaving her trembling and unsteady. She'd been assaulted, tased, in the very space where justice was supposed to reign, by a man who'd just proven, in the most grotesque way imaginable, how untouchable he believed himself to be. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, as she sucked in ragged breaths and met his gaze, Ayana wondered if he might be right. Even now, sprawled beneath the bailiff's grip, Bridges didn't look afraid. That smirk lingered, his confidence unshaken, his certainty absolute. He'd walk away from this, just like always. But what he couldn't see, what he couldn't possibly know, was that this time the ground had shifted beneath him. This time the world was watching. This time justice wouldn't bend so easily to his will. Hours later, the sterile scent of antiseptic hung thick in the hospital room where Ayana lay, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor slicing through the silence. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh, unforgiving glow, bleaching the white sheets draped over her until they felt like ice against her skin. Her body ached, weak and unsteady from the taser's aftershocks, but her mind raced, a relentless storm of thoughts she couldn't quiet. Her fingers twitched faintly when she tried to lift them, a maddening reminder of how powerless she'd been in that courtroom, how powerless he'd made her feel. She'd spent her life building a career on the law, pouring herself into the pursuit of justice, believing with every fiber of her being that the system could work if people like her fought for it. And yet, here she was, flat on her back in a hospital bed, not because she'd broken the rules, but because she'd dared to enforce them against Daniel Bridges. His name alone sent a jolt of fury through her jaw clenching as the memory replayed in vivid, excruciating detail. She could still see the way he'd stared at her, that smirk curling his lips like a taunt, the arrogance dripping from his voice as he mocked her authority in her own domain. Then the taser, the blinding snap of electricity, the violent shudder as her body convulsed against the surge, the searing humiliation of collapsing in front of everyone she'd sworn to lead. The physical pain had faded, but the deeper wound, the rage, the betrayal, burned hotter with every passing second. She could still hear the audience's gasps, the stunned silence that followed, the disbelief that something so brazen could happen in a place meant to stand for order. A sharp knock jolted her from her spiraling thoughts, and the door creaked open. Naomi Carter stepped inside, her presence filling the room with a quiet intensity. They'd been friends for over a decade, sisters in all but blood, and Ayanna could see the fury simmering in Naomi's dark eyes, barely held in check. She'd been there in the courtroom, front row, watching it all unfold, watching the taser strike, watching Ayanna crumple. Naomi shut the door with a soft click, her arms crossing tightly over her chest as if to hold herself together. When she spoke, her voice was thick with barely restrained anger. "Do you know what's happening out there?" Ayanna blinked, her throat raw as she rasped, "I can guess." Naomi's laugh was bitter, cutting. "No, you can't. The whole city's exploding. That video's everywhere. Every phone, every screen. People are livid. They're marching outside the courthouse, the police station, the mayor's office. Protests are popping up all over, and Bridges? He's sitting at home, cracking open a beer like he didn't just tase a judge in broad daylight." Ayanna exhaled slowly, pushing herself up against the pillows despite the ache radiating through her frame. "They put him on administrative leave, didn't they?" Naomi's scoff was sharp, her head shaking in disbelief. "Administrative leave? He's getting a paid vacation while you're stuck here, hooked up to machines. It's a joke." The words stung, but they didn't surprise her. The system had always bent over backward for men like Bridges, cops with badges they wielded like crowns, untouchable no matter how far they stepped over the line. It was why he'd been so bold, why he'd dared to pull that taser in the first place. He'd counted on walking away unscathed. Naomi stepped closer, her expression softening just enough to reveal the worry beneath her anger. "So what are you going to do about it?" Ayanna's chest tightened, a slow, smoldering fire igniting within her. "You think I'm letting this go?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. Naomi studied her for a long moment, then nodded, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good, because I'm not either." Over the next few days, the firestorm only grew. The video of Bridges tasing Ayanna had metastasized into a national scandal, replayed endlessly on news channels, and shared across social media with captions screaming for justice. Civil rights groups rallied, their leaders shouting into megaphones, demanding his arrest. Protesters flooded the streets, their signs bearing Ayanna's name alongside calls for reform. But despite the outrage, the response from those in power was maddeningly tepid. The police department issued a vague statement, calling the incident unfortunate, and promising a thorough internal review, words so hollow they might as well have been written in smoke. The mayor wrung his hands on live TV, expressing deep concern, but stopping short of any real action. And Bridges? He leaned into the spotlight, granting interviews with a casual swagger, spinning a tale of victimhood, claiming he'd felt threatened, that the situation had spiraled beyond his control. Some bought it, the same people who always rallied behind men like him, eager to excuse the inexcusable. From her hospital bed, Ayanna watched it all unfold, her anger sharpening with every carefully crafted lie Bridges fed the cameras. She'd seen this script before. The slow, deliberate erosion of accountability, the way the system closed ranks to protect its own. But this time, something felt different. This time, the public wasn't letting it fade into the background. This time, the consequences of abusing power, of defying justice, were too glaring to ignore. And as she lay there, her strength creeping back with each passing hour, Ayanna made a silent vow. Bridges might think he'd won, but he'd underestimated her. He'd underestimated the tide rising against him. Karma wasn't a distant promise anymore. It was a reckoning, and it was coming for him, whether he saw it or not. The city trembled under a sky heavy with unrest, its streets alive with the echoes of shouts and the bitter sting of tear gas drifting through the air. For years, men like Daniel Bridges had danced across the lines of morality and law, always landing on their feet with a smug certainty that no consequence could touch them. But this time, something had shifted. The outrage didn't fade into the usual quiet resignation. Instead, it grew, swelling into a force that refused to be ignored. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of protesters collided with riot police in a chaotic symphony of anger and resistance. Rubber bullets sliced through the haze, screams pierced the clamor, and the city teetered on the edge of something dark and unstoppable. Yet amidst it all, Bridges still walked free, or so he thought. In her office, Ayanna Johnson sat alone, the flickering glow of the television casting shadows across her face. Her fingers gripped a glass of water so tightly her knuckles paled, the cool surface a stark contrast to the heat rising in her chest. The news replayed the chaos outside, a relentless loop of injustice that gnawed at her. She had always believed in the law, trusted it as a pillar of fairness, a shield for the vulnerable. But now that faith crumbled, leaving a bitter taste in her mouth she couldn't swallow. She felt helpless, a sensation so foreign it clawed at her insides. She had spent years building a career on the promise of justice, and yet here she was, watching it fail her, and everyone else, on live television. A knock at the door jolted her from her spiraling thoughts. She looked up, expecting Naomi, her sharp-witted assistant who always seemed to know when to push and when to pull back. But this time Naomi wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a man Ayanna didn't recognize. Tall and impeccably dressed, he carried himself with a quiet gravitas, the kind that came from years of wading through the muck of humanity's worst moments. His name was Marcus King, a federal prosecutor, Naomi explained, her voice tinged with an urgency that made Ayanna's stomach twist. Marcus stepped forward, his expression unreadable, and took a seat across from her. Without a word, he placed a thick folder on the desk and slid it toward her. "I need you to look at this," he said, his tone steady but weighted with something unspoken. Ayanna hesitated, her fingers brushing the folder's edge before she opened it. As she scanned the documents inside, her pulse quickened, a drumbeat of realization thudding in her ears. Page after page revealed secrets, dark, sprawling secrets, that Bridges had buried deep. Her eyes snapped up to Marcus, searching his face for some hint of doubt, some crack in the facade.
"This is real?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper, fragile with disbelief. He nodded.
"It is."
She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping back to the papers. This wasn't just about the humiliation Bridges had inflicted on her, the way he'd paraded his power in her courtroom like a king mocking a peasant. No, this was bigger, far bigger than her personal wounds. If what she held in her hands was true, then the man who'd thought himself untouchable was standing on the edge of a precipice, oblivious to the abyss yawning beneath him. And Ayanna, once his victim, was about to become the one who pushed him over. The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy, packed to the brim with a sea of onlookers. Some sat with tense anticipation, their jaws tight, while others leaned forward, eyes gleaming with a hunger for retribution. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of history unfolding in real time. This wasn't just another trial, another charade where the guilty slipped through the cracks of a corrupt system. This was a reckoning. At the defendant's table, Daniel Bridges sat rigid, his fingers tapping an erratic rhythm against the polished wood. The arrogance that had once defined him, the swagger of a man who believed himself above the law, had begun to fray. For years, he'd wielded his badge like a weapon, confident that the system would shield him, that his fellow officers would turn a blind eye, that the world would bend to his will. But now, those walls were closing in, and for the first time, he felt the unfamiliar sting of vulnerability. Across the room, Judge Ayanna Johnson presided with a calm that belied the storm raging within her. She was no longer the woman he'd humiliated, no longer the powerless figure he'd mocked in front of a stunned audience. Today, she was something else, a force of nature, a tide that had turned against him. The world had seen her fall, watched as he'd stripped her dignity bare, but now it bore witness to her ascent, her Her eyes, steady and unyielding, met his from the bench, and in that moment he understood. She wasn't just here to judge him. She was here to dismantle the myth he'd built around himself. The trial had stretched on for days, each hour peeling back another layer of Bridges' carefully constructed facade. He'd assumed this was about Ayanna, about the single act of arrogance that had sparked this fire. He'd been wrong. That moment in her courtroom had been the match, but the inferno now consuming him had been fueled by years of buried crimes. Marcus King, relentless and precise, had led the prosecution with a ferocity that left no stone unturned. He'd unearthed files long thought lost, tampered body cam footage, complaints vanished from internal affairs, surveillance tapes showing Bridges brutalizing suspects with a grin, secure in the knowledge that no one would dare challenge him. One by one, witnesses took the stand, their voices trembling but resolute as they recounted the terror he'd inflicted. The courtroom sat in stunned silence as the truth unfurled. This wasn't just a rogue cop. This was a predator who'd thrived on fear, who'd built his legacy on the broken bodies and silenced cries of those he'd crushed. The final witness stepped forward, a young man in his early 20s whose every movement spoke of survival. A limp marked his gait. A jagged scar stretched across his cheek like a cruel signature of the night that had changed him. He carried himself with a quiet strength, the kind forged in the aftermath of unimaginable pain. As he settled into the witness stand, he adjusted the microphone with deliberate care, took a deep breath, and began. His voice was steady as he described the night Bridges had pulled him over. A routine stop, he'd thought, until routine turned to nightmare. He spoke of being yanked from his car, the pavement biting into his skin as Bridges slammed him down. He recounted the weight of a knee pressing into his back, the air squeezed from his lungs, the terror of believing he might die there, helpless and unheard. Bridges had laughed as he tightened the cuffs until they cut into his wrists, laughed as he shoved him into the squad car, laughed as he sneered, "No one's going to believe you." But now, the young man stared across the room at Bridges, his gaze a mix of defiance and something deeper, something that lingered between justice and unresolved pain. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus rose, his voice slicing through the stillness. "Officer Bridges," he said, each word deliberate. "Do you have anything to say?" Bridges's jaw tightened. For days he'd sat there, clinging to the hope that he'd slip through the cracks as he always had. He'd seen worse scandals fade, watched his peers walk free, trusted the system to protect its own. But this time, the weight of every stare, every camera, every voice he'd silenced pressed down on him. His lawyer whispered frantically, "Don't speak, don't react, we can still fight this." But the words were drowned out by the roar of his own pulse. For the first time, he had no defense, no clever retort. For the first time, he felt the power he'd wielded slip through his fingers like sand. Marcus turned to the bench. "Your Honor, the prosecution rests." Ayanna held Bridges' gaze, unflinching. She'd spent years watching men like him escape justice, their crimes buried under layers of privilege and corruption. But today was different. Today, the scales had tipped. As whispers rippled through the courtroom and reporters scrambled to capture the moment, Bridges sat motionless, the man who'd once thrived on fear, now reduced to its prisoner. Ayanna didn't smile. She didn't need to. The lesson was clear. Power abused would always meet its reckoning. And for Daniel Bridges, that reckoning had only just begun. The air in the courtroom hung heavy, thick with tension that seemed to cling to every surface, every breath, every fleeting glance. The video of Daniel Bridges' brutal attack on Ayanna had played on a flickering screen for all to see, grainy footage that captured not just the violence, but the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Now, that same man sat rigid in his chair, his broad shoulders hunched slightly as though the weight of the world had finally found him. His hands gripped the edge of the table, fingers digging into the wood until his knuckles blanched a stark, ghostly white. His mind churned in chaotic spirals, grappling with the unraveling of a life he'd spent years constructing, a fortress built on intimidation, power, and the certainty that no one would ever dare hold him accountable. The silence around him wasn't just quiet. It was suffocating, pressing in from all sides, a relentless force that mirrored the dread pooling in his chest. Across the room, Ayanna sat still, her face a mask of calm that betrayed nothing of the storm raging beneath. Her dark eyes, sharp and unyielding, bore into Bridges with a weight he couldn't ignore. She didn't need to speak for him to feel the gravity of her presence, the silent accusation that cut deeper than any words. For years, he'd thrived on making others shrink, on bending them to his will with a badge and a sneer. But now, under her gaze, he felt something unfamiliar, something small and fragile and utterly foreign. Shame, perhaps? Fear? Whatever it was, it gnawed at him, an uncomfortable itch he couldn't scratch away. His chest tightened as he realized that for the first time the tables had turned, and he was the one trapped, exposed, powerless. The prosecutor had laid out the case with meticulous care, each piece of evidence a brick in an unassailable wall. Documents, signed and stamped with dates he couldn't deny, sat in neat stacks. Witness testimonies, quivering voices that had once been silenced by fear, rang out clear and steady, painting a vivid picture of his reign of terror. And then there was the footage, that damning reel of his own cruelty, replayed in slow motion for the world to dissect. It wasn't just a case. It was a masterpiece of justice, crafted with such precision that even the most corrupt corners of the system couldn't bend it to his favor. Bridges had always prided himself on finding the cracks, the loopholes, the whispered deals that kept him afloat. But now, as the world watched through screens and courtroom windows, those cracks had sealed shut. There was no shadow left to hide in. Beside him, his lawyer leaned in close, the man's breath hot and urgent against his ear. "We still have options, Daniel," he hissed, his voice a frantic whisper laced with desperation. "A plea deal, cooperation, something to soften the blow. We can still salvage this." Bridges' jaw clenched, the muscles twitching as he shook his head slowly, deliberately. "No," he growled, his voice low and rough, threaded with a defiance that felt hollow even to him. "No deals." The lawyer's face tightened, lines deepening around his eyes as panic flickered across his features. "Daniel, listen to me," he pressed, his tone rising slightly. "They've got everything. Documents, witnesses, the damn video. If you fight this, they'll bury you alive." Bridges didn't respond immediately. His gaze dropped to the polished tabletop, the wood gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. His mind raced, clawing at possibilities, searching for an angle he hadn't considered, a favor to call in, a string to pull. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized there was nothing left. The walls were closing in, tighter and tighter, and for the first time in his life, escape was a fantasy he couldn't afford to indulge. The judge's voice cut through the haze, sharp and commanding. "Mr. Bridges, do you have anything to say before we proceed?" The room turned as one, dozens of eyes pinning him in place. For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. His lawyer nudged him gently, a silent plea to speak, to offer something, anything that might sway the tide. But Bridges wasn't wired for begging. He didn't grovel, didn't bend. Slowly, he lifted his head, his steely gaze locking onto Ayanna's. "You think you've won?" he rasped, his voice hoarse and bitter, dripping with a venom he couldn't quite mask. "You think this changes anything?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the onlookers, a soft wave of shock and curiosity. Ayanna didn't flinch. She held his stare, her expression steady as stone, unshaken by his venom. Bridges let out a slow, ragged breath, shaking his head as if dismissing her victory. "This system," he said, his tone hardening, "it was built for men like me. You really think slapping cuffs on me rewrites the rules?" Ayanna leaned forward then, her hands resting lightly on the bench in front of her. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, measured, but it carried a force that sent a shiver racing down his spine. "You're right about one thing, Bridges," she said, her words deliberate and piercing. "This system was built for men like you, designed to shield you, to let you run rampant. But that's exactly why you're sitting there now, drowning in the mess you made." Her words lingered, heavy and unyielding, settling over the room like a thick fog. Bridges swallowed hard, his throat dry, but he forced a smirk onto his lips, a flimsy shield against the truth sinking into his bones. He wanted to believe he could still bluff his way out, that none of this truly mattered. But the cracks in his armor were widening. The prosecutor stepped forward again, his presence slicing through the tension like a blade. "Mr. Bridges," he began, his voice steady and resonant, "you speak as if this is just about you. A single man, a single story. But it's so much bigger than that. This isn't just about one case, one victim, one fleeting moment of cruelty. This is about every soul you've crushed under your heel, every report you buried in a drawer, every witness you terrified into silence, every family left to grieve someone they should have been able to trust." The words landed like blows, each one stripping away another layer of Bridges' defiance. His smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, as the weight of those lives, those countless nameless faces, pressed down on him. "For years," the prosecutor continued, his tone unwavering, "you've hidden behind that badge, cloaked yourself in a system that turned a blind eye to your sins. But today that shield is gone. Today you face the justice you've denied so many others." The room fell silent again, a stillness so profound it seemed to hum in Bridges' ears. He clenched his jaw tighter, the ache spreading through his face, but he couldn't stop the tremor in his hands. "And what?" he snapped, his voice rough with desperation. "You think locking me up fixes it all? You think one trial erases decades of this?" Ayana's gaze didn't waver. "No," she said softly, her voice a quiet thunder. "But it's a start." The simplicity of her answer stung more than any accusation. A stark reminder that this wasn't the end of the war, just the first step toward dismantling the empire he'd built on others' pain. The judge shifted in her seat, her stern eyes sweeping the room before settling on the prosecutor. "Is the prosecution prepared to move forward?" she asked, her tone clipped and final. "Yes, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied, standing taller. "We request the court proceed to sentencing immediately." Bridges' lawyer shot to his feet, his voice trembling with urgency. "Your Honor, we request a delay in sentencing. My client—" The judge didn't let him finish. "Denied," she said, her voice a steel blade cutting through his plea. "This court sees no reason to delay justice any longer." The words hit Bridges like a physical force, knocking the air from his lungs. His breathing grew shallow, ragged as the reality bore down on him. There was no reprieve, no last-minute savior riding in to pull him from the fire. For once, the powerful friends, the backroom deals, the whispered promises, they were all gone. He was alone, truly alone, in a way he'd never imagined possible. The judge took a slow, deliberate breath, her gaze dropping to the papers spread before her. Then she looked up, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his stomach twist. "Daniel Bridges," she began, her voice steady and resolute. "You have been found guilty on all counts. The court hereby sentences you to—" The gavel came down, a sharp, resounding crack that echoed through the room, final and absolute. In that instant, the world tilted beneath him. The walls he'd built, walls of arrogance, of power, of fear, crumbled to dust. As the sound faded, a chilling realization settled into his core. There was no way out. Not this time. The courtroom doors swung open behind him, and two officers stepped forward, their boots clicking against the polished floor. Their faces were blank, professional masks that gave nothing away. No pity, no satisfaction, just duty. The crowd's whispers grew louder, a rising tide of voices murmuring about justice finally served, about the fall of a tyrant. The officers reached him, their hands firm as they pulled him to his feet. The cold metal of the cuffs bit into his wrists, a sensation so alien it made his skin crawl. Every eye in the room pressed against him, a collective weight he couldn't shake. Just before they led him away, he lifted his head one last time, his gaze finding Ayana's. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Justice had won this round. The doors closed behind him with a dull thud, muffling the chaos of the courtroom as the officers guided him down a stark, fluorescent-lit hallway. His footsteps echoed, a hollow rhythm that matched the pounding in his chest. Outside, beyond those walls, Ayana stepped into the blinding afternoon sun, the light harsh against her skin, but doing little to warm the cold knot in her gut. The noise of the world rushed back. Reporters shouting questions, cameras buzzing, the crowd's murmurs swelling into a distant roar. It was over, in a way. The trial, the verdict, the sentence. They'd reached their end. But justice? Justice wasn't a neat conclusion, a bow tied on a finished story. It was a fight, a long, grueling war, and today had been just one battle won. Naomi stood waiting near the courthouse steps, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her sharp eyes scanning Ayana as she approached. The older woman's face was a map of hard-earned lines, etched by years of standing beside Ayana through the worst of it. Late nights poring over evidence, quiet moments holding her when the weight became too much. "You did it," Naomi said, her voice steady but tinged with something raw, something that knew triumph always came with a cost. Ayana exhaled, a slow, shaky breath that carried the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights. She shook her head slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We did it," she corrected, her tone soft but firm. Naomi tilted her head, studying her friend with a mix of concern and curiosity. "Then why don't you look like someone who just won?" Ayana sighed, her gaze drifting to the horizon where the city sprawled under a sky too bright for the heaviness she carried. "Because justice isn't clean, Naomi," she said, her voice low and weary. "It's messy, it's brutal, and it leaves scars on everyone." Naomi nodded slowly, her silence a quiet agreement. She'd seen enough to know Ayana was right, that every victory came with a price. Every step forward left someone bleeding. Back in the depths of the courthouse, Bridges sat in a holding cell, the cuffs still tight around his wrists, the concrete walls closing in. His mind replayed the day, the prosecutor's words, Ayana's unflinching stare, the judge's final decree. He'd always believed power was eternal, that men like him were untouchable, that the system would bend to protect its own. But now, stripped of his badge, his influence, his freedom, he saw the lesson etched in the ruins of his life. Power abused would always demand a reckoning. Justice might not fix everything, might not heal every wound or right every wrong, but it could start somewhere. And for Daniel Bridges, that start was a cold cell and a sentence he couldn't outrun. The air outside the courthouse buzzed with restless energy, thick with the clamor of voices that refused to fade even as the sun dipped lower in the sky. A sea of faces stretched across the steps and spilled onto the street. Reporters with their microphones poised like weapons, cameramen angling for the perfect shot, and onlookers clutching signs that trembled in their hands. They were ravenous, starving for something more than just the scraps of a story they'd already been fed. They wanted sound bites to chew on, headlines to plaster across screens, a neat little bow to tie up the mess of it all. But Ayan stood at the center of the storm, her dark eyes sweeping over the chaos, and she knew better than most that life didn't wrap itself up so cleanly. There was no final page to turn here, no epilogue to satisfy the crowd's hunger. Justice, she'd learned long ago, wasn't a gift handed out. It was a battle carved from stone, and even a victory like this one left her hands bruised and her heart heavy. She turned to face them fully, her coat swaying slightly in the late March wind, her posture steady despite the ache that gnawed at her bones. The cameras flashed in a relentless rhythm, a blinding staccato that might have rattled someone less resolved. Microphones thrust toward her, a tangle of metal and wire, while voices overlapped in a frantic chorus, shouting her name, demanding answers, pleading for a piece of her. She didn't lift a hand to hush them. She didn't need to. The moment her lips parted, the noise fell away, as if the world itself held its breath.
"This trial," she began, her voice cutting through the silence with a calm, unyielding clarity, "was never about just one man." Her words hung in the air, deliberate and weighty. It was about accountability, about giving a voice to those who've suffered in the shadows for too long. It was about the families who've buried their loved ones without ever seeing justice. Today, the system did its job. But don't mistake this for a cure. One win doesn't erase decades of broken promises, and I won't rest until justice stops being a fluke and starts being the standard. The crowd stirred, a ripple of murmurs and scribbling pens. But Ayan didn't linger to feed their appetite. She'd said what needed saying, and that was enough. Turning on her heel, she moved through the throng, her steps measured but firm, brushing past the outstretched hands and the lenses that tracked her every move. The city around her thrummed with tension, debates still smoldering in the streets, smoke curling from the embers of a trial that had set everything ablaze. She could feel the eyes on her, some wide with awe, others narrowed with doubt, but she kept walking. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. Bridges might have been the face of this fight, but he was just one cog in a machine that had been grinding down the vulnerable for years. Tearing him out didn't stop the gears from turning. Still, it was something. A crack in the iron facade, a splinter of light piercing through. And maybe, she thought as the courthouse loomed behind her, maybe that was enough to start with. Deep within the belly of that same courthouse, down a dimly lit corridor where the air hung heavy with the sting of bleach and the musk of despair, Bridges sat alone. The holding cell was a stark, suffocating box. 4 concrete walls, a chipped metal bench bolted to the floor, and a fluorescent bulb overhead that buzzed and flickered like a dying moth. His wrists, still bound by the cold bite of handcuffs, rested heavily in his lap, the metal digging into his skin with every slight shift. He tilted his head back against the wall, staring up at the cracked ceiling, and let the sounds of the place seep into his awareness, the distant clatter of boots on tile, the low hum of guards trading idle words, the sharp clang of steel gates slamming shut. It was a symphony of confinement, one he'd never imagined himself part of. For the first time in his life, there was no escape hatch, no slick-talking lawyer or well-placed favor to pull him out of the muck. The department had already begun its dance of disavowal, issuing statements that painted him as a lone wolf, a rogue who'd strayed from the pack, not a product of the system, but an aberration they could discard and forget. He'd seen it happen before, watched from the sidelines as other officers were cut loose when the spotlight grew too hot. He'd smirked then, secure in his own untouchability, certain his connections and his badge would always shield him. But now, sitting in this barren cell with nothing but his own thoughts for company, the irony twisted in his gut like a dull blade. His allies had vanished, evaporating into the ether the moment the gavel fell. The men in suits who had once clapped him on the back and whispered assurances were nowhere to be found. Days crawled by, each one bleeding into the next, and outside, the world churned on without him. Protests flared in the streets, their chants echoing faintly through the walls. News channels looped their coverage, pundits slicing apart the trial, the verdict, the sentence, the man himself, with surgical precision. Some hailed it as a step forward, a triumph of accountability. Others dismissed it as a hollow gesture, a scapegoat tossed to the masses to quiet their rage. Bridges didn't care what they called it. To him, it was just the end of the line. Back in the city, Ayan sat alone in her office as night draped itself over the skyline, the glow of streetlights filtering through the blinds in thin, wavering stripes. Papers littered her desk, case files, notes, a half-empty coffee cup she hadn't touched in hours. Her fingers pressed together in a steeple, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the walls as her mind wrestled with the day's echoes. The trial had ended. Bridges had been led away in chains. The crowd had cheered and jeered in equal measure. Justice, or at least the version the system could stomach, had been delivered. Yet the knot in her chest refused to loosen. She knew the truth too well. One man's fall didn't topple the tower. It didn't undo the years of silence, the lives snuffed out, the officers still walking free with blood on their hands and badges on their chests.
She exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples as the weight of it all pressed down harder. The soft creak of the door broke her reverie, and she glanced up to see Naomi slipping inside, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. Her friend moved with a quiet grace, setting the cup on the desk before sinking into the chair opposite Ayan. "You're thinking too much again," Naomi said, her tone light but laced with knowing. Ayan let out a tired breath, leaning back in her chair as she met Naomi's steady gaze. "Do you ever wonder if this is all just a show?" she asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. Naomi arched an eyebrow, inviting her to go on. Ayan waved a hand vaguely, frustration simmering beneath her words. The outrage, the trial, the sentencing. It's like the system tossed Bridges out as a sacrifice so it could dust off its hands and carry on like nothing's wrong. Naomi didn't answer right away. She took a slow sip of her own coffee, her eyes narrowing slightly as she weighed her response. "You're not wrong," she said finally, setting the mug down with a soft clink. "But that doesn't mean it was meaningless." She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her voice dropping with quiet intensity. "That kid who testified, the one Bridges almost killed, he called me today, said he finally feels like someone heard him. That's not nothing, Ayan." The words settled between them, heavy and real, and Ayan felt them sink into her bones. Maybe Naomi was right. Maybe it did matter, even if it felt like a drop in an endless sea. Maybe every crack in the wall, no matter how small, was a step toward tearing it all down. Outside, the city pulsed with restless life, its streets alive with voices that refused to be silenced. The courthouse stood empty now, its halls quiet save for the ghosts of the trial that still lingered in the air. But the fight, the real fight, was far from over. Ayan knew that as surely as she knew her own name. And as she sat there, staring into the night, she felt the ember of resolve flare brighter within her. This was just the beginning. The door swung open again, pulling her from her thoughts, and Marcus King stepped inside, his broad frame filling the doorway. He carried a thick folder in his hand, his face etched with a weariness that matched her own. He shut the door behind him with a quiet thud, letting out a slow breath before speaking. "It's not over." Ayan straightened, her eyes sharpening as she caught the edge in his tone. "What do you mean?" she asked, already bracing herself. Marcus crossed the room and dropped the folder onto her desk, sliding it toward her with a grim nod. "Bridges' legal team just filed an appeal. They're pushing to overturn the conviction, claiming procedural misconduct." Naomi let out a sharp scoff, shaking her head in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." Ayan flipped open the folder, her fingers moving quickly as she scanned the pages. Legal jargon, arguments, a carefully crafted narrative. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice tight. Marcus rubbed his jaw, his expression darkening. "They're saying the jury was swayed by public pressure, the protests, the media frenzy. They're arguing it created an unfair trial, that his past acquittals prove this was a witch hunt, not justice. They're spinning it like the system caved to the mob instead of following the law." Ayan's jaw clenched, a surge of frustration coiling in her chest. "So because he dodged accountability before, he should have gotten away with it again?" she snapped, her eyes flashing. Marcus gave a dry, bitter chuckle. "That's their angle." Naomi muttered something under her breath, her hands curling into fists. The room grew heavier, the air thick with the sting of betrayal. Not from Bridges, but from a system that seemed determined to shield its own, even now. Ayan stared at the papers, her mind racing. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about the machine that kept churning, the gears that kept grinding, and the cracks they'd have to widen if they ever wanted to see it fall. The fight, she realized, had only just begun. Ayanna sat motionless at her desk, the folder snapping shut beneath her trembling hands as she pressed her fingertips together, her mind a storm of frustration and resolve. The air in her cramped office felt heavy, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were conspiring to trap the tension within. She could still hear the faint hum of the city beyond the window, a restless, living thing that refused to quiet, its pulse fueled by outrage and whispers of justice unfulfilled. Her dark eyes flickered with a mix of exhaustion and determination as she considered the absurdity of it all. Bridges, a man who had spent decades cloaked in untouchable authority, was guilty, painfully, undeniably so. Yet here they were, his allies scrambling like rats in the shadows, desperate to shield him from the consequences he'd earned. It made her stomach twist, the bitter taste of betrayal lingering as she realized how deep the rot went. They couldn't stomach one of their own facing the music, and they'd bend every rule, pull every string to keep him safe. Marcus lingered near the door, his broad shoulders tense, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His hesitation hung in the room like a storm cloud, a rare crack in his usual unshakable demeanor. "What are the odds this actually sticks?" Ayana's voice was low, measured, but laced with a quiet dread she couldn't quite bury. He shifted his weight, his jaw clenching as he searched for an answer that wouldn't sting. "Slim, normally," he admitted, his tone gravelly, reluctant. "But Bridges, he's still got people, powerful ones, friends in high places who'll twist arms, call in favors. If they land a sympathetic judge or enough political muscle, they could drag this out for months, years even. They don't need to prove he's clean, just muddy the waters enough to make the verdict look shaky." His words landed like stones in still water, rippling through Ayana's thoughts as she leaned back in her chair, exhaling a slow, deliberate breath that did little to ease the knot in her chest. Outside, the city churned on, a restless beast of concrete and voices. The streets thrummed with life, protesters chanting, horns blaring, conversations spilling from crowded corners into the night. It was a symphony of defiance, a refusal to let Bridges' conviction fade into a footnote. The courthouse itself seemed to tremble under the weight of it all, its marble walls soaking up the anger and anticipation like a sponge, holding tight to the electric charge of a fight far from over. Ayana could feel it pressing against her, a reminder that the people weren't done, that they wouldn't settle for a single gavel's fall. Justice, they screamed, wasn't a moment. It was a reckoning. "So what do we do?" Her voice cut through the silence, sharp and steady despite the weariness tugging at her bones. Marcus met her gaze, his eyes dark and unflinching, a soldier ready for war. "We don't let them spin this their way," he said firmly. "We keep the truth front and center, remind everyone who he is, what he's done. They want to slug it out in court? Fine. But we hit harder where it counts, with the people. We make sure the public's eyes stay wide open." Across the room, Naomi's lips curled into a sly, approving smirk, her sharp features catching the dim light as she leaned forward. "Now that's my kind of game," she said, her voice dripping with a mix of mischief and resolve, her fingers pausing mid-scroll on her phone as she absorbed his words. Ayana nodded slowly, but a shadow lingered in her mind, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. What if they won? What if, after all this, they pried open the cage and set him free? She didn't voice it aloud, not yet, but Marcus seemed to read it in her silence. "If they overturn it," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a fierce whisper, "we make damn sure he's got nowhere to hide. We dig up every scrap, every report, every victim's story, every case they buried to keep him golden. If they try to let him walk, we light up the sky with the truth until the whole world sees what kind of monster they're shielding." His words were a lifeline, pulling her back from the brink of doubt, and she let them settle, heavy and certain, as she weighed the path ahead. Bridges had built his life on the belief that he was beyond reach, untouchable, invincible. Even now, with the cuffs still fresh on his wrists, he had lackeys ready to bleed for him. But this time, the rules had shifted. The world was watching, and Ayana swore she'd make them see. Naomi lounged across from her, legs crossed casually, though her eyes burned with a restless fire as she scrolled through the endless stream of headlines on her phone. The office was a mess. Papers strewn across the desk, coffee cups abandoned in corners, the air thick with the stale scent of late nights and stubborn hope.
They're already moving, Naomi said suddenly, her voice cutting through the haze, sharp and biting. The media's starting to shift. They're floating the idea that Bridges was just a fall guy, a convenient target to quiet the mob. Not justice, just theater. They're calling him a political pawn. Ayanna didn't lift her eyes from the court filings spread before her, but her fingers tightened against her temples, a dull ache pulsing beneath them. Of course they are, she muttered, her tone dry as dust. If they admit this was right, they'd have to own up to all the times they let him slide, all the failures they ignored. Naomi let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head as she tossed her phone onto the desk with a clatter. They're saying the trial was a rush job, protests skewed the jury, you had some personal grudge driving this. Like the evidence didn't matter, like it wasn't about the blood on his hands. Ayanna finally closed the file, leaning back in her chair with a sigh that felt like it carried the weight of years.
Funny how they only care about fairness when it's him in the hot seat,
she said, her voice laced with quiet fury. Where was that concern when he was out there breaking people in the streets? Marcus stepped forward, his boots scuffing the worn carpet, his face shadowed with grim resolve. It's worse, he said, his tone flat but heavy. They just filed to bump up his bail hearing. If they pull it off, he could be out in weeks. Naomi snapped upright, her brows knitting together in disbelief.
You're kidding me,
she hissed, her casual poise evaporating into raw indignation. Ayanna's grip tightened on the edge of her desk, the wood biting into her palms as she fought to keep her composure. They're really doing this, she said, more to herself than anyone else, her mind already racing through every angle, every counterpunch. Marcus nodded, his expression carved from stone. They're betting the outrage will fizzle. People get tired, move on. If they stretch this out, they think they can sneak him through the cracks. Ayanna set the folder down with deliberate care, her movements slow, controlled, masking the storm brewing inside her.
Then we don't let it die,
she said, rising from her chair and pacing to the window. Below, the city sprawled out in a restless glow, protesters still gathered in clumps, their signs bobbing like beacons in the dark, their voices a distant roar that refused to fade. The system was a predator, always lurking, waiting for the flames of resistance to dim just enough to slink back into the shadows. How long do we have? She asked, her back to the room, her eyes tracing the flickering lights. Marcus glanced at his watch, the faint tick of its hands cutting through the silence. 2 weeks. Less if they push hard. Naomi exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. That's nothing. They'll try to bury it, keep it quiet, slide it past everyone before the noise picks up. Ayanna's jaw tightened, her reflection staring back at her in the glass, fierce and unyielding.
Then we don't give them the chance, she said, turning to face them. We blast it everywhere, every network, every reporter, every voice that's been screaming for this. We don't just hold the line, we push it harder. Marcus nodded, a flicker of approval in his steady gaze. We've got to move quick. If they take the reins, they'll twist this into something ugly. Naomi leaned forward, elbows on her knees, her smirk returning with a razor's edge. Let's make the truth louder than their bullshit, she said, her words a spark igniting the room. The next 2 weeks erupted into chaos, a relentless, beautiful war of will. Every journalist they could reach, every advocate who'd ever stood on those courthouse steps, every soul who'd tasted the sting of Bridges' brutality was called back into the fray. The headlines didn't soften. The conversations didn't wane. The pressure swelled, a tidal wave crashing against the system's fragile walls. By the time the bail hearing dawned, the courthouse was a fortress under siege. Protesters choked the steps, their chants a thunderous heartbeat, while cameras and reporters swarmed like vultures, hungry for the next bite of the story. The city didn't just watch. It held its breath. The nation followed suit. Inside the courtroom, Ayanna sat near the front, her presence a quiet storm, radiating strength without a word. Bridges shuffled in, flanked by guards, his tailored suit hanging stiffly on his frame. His face was a mask, carefully blank, practiced, but she caught the faint tremor in his hands, the subtle tightening of his mouth. For years, he'd wielded power like a blade, cutting down anyone who dared stand in his way, certain the system would always catch him when he fell. Now that certainty was fraying, thread by thread. The defense launched into their plea, their voices smooth and calculated, painting him as a martyr, a man sacrificed to appease a bloodthirsty crowd. They claimed the trial was tainted, the protests a poison that had seeped into the jury's minds, rendering fairness impossible. He was no criminal, they argued, but a casualty of a world too eager to tear down its own. Naomi, seated beside Ayanna, muttered under her breath, her words dripping with venom. They always cry fairness when it's their guy on the ropes. Ayanna didn't respond, her eyes locked on Bridges. He still believed he'd walk free. She could see it in the way he held himself, the ghost of arrogance clinging to his posture. The prosecution rose, their voices cutting through the haze, laying out the truth with surgical precision. Every act of violence, every buried complaint, every life he'd crushed under his boot, they piled it high, a mountain of evidence too tall to ignore. They spoke of justice, of accountability, of a system finally forced to face its own reflection. The judge's gavel fell, the words bail denied ringing out like a gunshot. The room seemed to exhale all at once, the air shifting as the weight of it settled. Bridges froze, his fingers curling into tight fists, his jaw locking so hard Ayanna thought it might crack. For the first time she saw it, the flicker of fear, the dawning realization that the shield he'd hidden behind was gone. The guards moved toward him, their steps heavy, deliberate, but before they could lead him away, he turned. His eyes found hers, piercing and raw, stripped of the smug confidence that had once defined him. There was no defiance left, only the slow, creeping terror of a man who'd finally run out of moves. Ayanna held his stare, unflinching, her heart a steady drumbeat of resolve. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The lesson was clear. Power, when abused, forged its own chains. Justice wasn't a gift. It was a fight, and she'd make sure the world never forgot it. Naomi leaned in, her voice a quiet blade in the stillness. "Round one," she said, and Ayanna nodded, the fire in her chest burning brighter than ever. The city had its own heartbeat, a rhythm that pulsed through its streets, its people, its very soul. For years, it had thrummed along to a tune dictated by those who held power, those who wore badges, who sat in high offices, who believed they could bend justice to their will. But now, for the first time, that rhythm faltered. The protests that once roared through the avenues had faded to a murmur. The headlines had drifted to fresher scandals, yet the echoes of what had happened lingered like a scar etched into the city's skin. Something had shifted, something irrevocable. Bridges, a man who once strode through life with the swagger of untouchability, had been the spark. His fall didn't just topple a single corrupt figure. It pried open a rusted gate, exposing the decay of a system that had thrived on silence and complicity. And once that gate swung wide, there was no forcing it shut again. Inside the prison, time didn't flow. It crawled. The days stretched into a gray, suffocating haze, each one bleeding into the next with no discernible end. Bridges sat on the edge of his cot, the cold steel frame biting into his thighs, his once crisp uniform replaced by a threadbare jumpsuit that hung loose on his frame. He'd been a king once, or so he'd thought. Chest puffed out, badge gleaming, voice barking orders that men scrambled to obey. Courtrooms had been his stage, where he'd swaggered in with a grin that said he'd never face a reckoning. Now those same walls that once echoed his commands confined him, their iron embrace unyielding. The men around him weren't strangers. They were ghosts of his past, faces he'd once sneered at through the bars of a holding cell, men whose lives he'd crushed beneath his boot without a second thought. Their eyes followed him now, sharp and unblinking, tracking his every step down the shadowed corridors. He could feel the weight of their stares, a silent promise of retribution he'd once dealt out so freely. In the world he'd ruled, power had been his shield. He'd thrived in a hierarchy where favors flowed like currency,
where a whispered word to the right ear could bury any mistake. But here, stripped of his title, his connections, his armor, he was nothing. The first few days, he'd tried to cling to that old bravado, chin up, shoulders squared, barking at anyone who dared meet his gaze. It didn't last. A hulking inmate with a scar snaking down his cheek had shoved him against a wall, breath hot and sour as he hissed, "You're not the boss here, pig." The words landed like a punch, and Bridges felt something crack inside him. Not his ribs, but his pride. He'd spent decades convincing himself he was invincible, that the rules didn't apply to him. Now, every creak of the prison floor, every murmur from the shadows reminded him how wrong he'd been. Justice, he was learning, wasn't a gavel's bang or a judge's decree. It was the slow, relentless grind of consequences he could no longer outrun. Outside those walls, the department scrambled to erase him. His old colleagues, men he'd shared beers with, swapped stories with, covered for, acted like he'd been a stranger all along. They shuffled papers, issued press releases dripping with hollow indignation, swore they'd root out the bad apples. But the words rang empty, and the city wasn't buying it anymore. People gathered in the streets, their voices quieter now but no less resolute, demanding more than promises. Investigations sprouted like weeds, names tumbling out. Officers who'd worn the same badge as Bridges, who'd wielded the same unchecked power, who'd hidden behind the same shield of silence. The system that had cradled them all was starting to buckle, its cracks widening under the pressure of a public that refused to look away. Ayan stood on the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the stone. Her coat flapped in the breeze as she watched another officer, handcuffs glinting on his wrists, being escorted through the double doors. Her chest tightened with a mix of exhaustion and hope, a bittersweet cocktail she'd grown accustomed to. Beside her, Naomi leaned against the railing, arms crossed, her lips curling into a faint, triumphant smirk. "Told you they wouldn't forget," she said, her voice low but steady. Ayan exhaled slowly, her breath fogging in the crisp air. "No, they didn't." It wasn't enough. Not yet. The wounds ran too deep, the rot too pervasive. But it was a start, a fragile thread of progress she could cling to. She thought of the families she'd met over the years, mothers with tear-streaked faces, fathers with clenched fists, children who'd grown up too fast. Their stories, once buried, were clawing their way into the light, forcing the system to face its sins one painful piece at a time. Bridges faded into the background, his name no longer a thunderclap but a whisper, a warning etched into the city's memory. Once he'd been a titan, feared and revered, his authority a weapon he'd swung without remorse. Now he was a relic, a shadow of a man who'd bet everything on a lie. That power could shield him forever. As months turned to years, Ayan found herself back in a courtroom, but this time the air felt different, charged with possibility. She stood before a panel, her hand raised, swearing an oath to a higher court. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, not just the title, but the fight that had brought her here. She'd faced sleepless nights, threats scrawled on crumpled notes, moments when despair had nearly swallowed her whole. But those trials had forged her into something unbreakable. As applause rippled through the chamber, her eyes locked with Naomi's in the crowd. "We're just getting started," she said, her voice firm with conviction. And she meant every word. But the story didn't end with Bridges, or with Ayan's rise. He was just one thread in a tangled web, the one who'd slipped through the cracks and landed in the spotlight when the tide turned. How many others still lurked in the shadows, their badges gleaming, their hands stained? Justice wasn't a gift handed down from on high. It was a battle, fought inch by inch, voice by voice. It demanded people who wouldn't flinch, who wouldn't settle for half-truths or hollow reforms. Bridges' fall was a lesson carved in stone. When power festers unchecked, it breeds monsters. But when people rise, those monsters crumble. The city moved forward, its heartbeat steadier now, but the question lingered in the air like smoke. How many more reckonings were still to come? Meanwhile, miles away, Another story was unfolding, one that would test that fragile pulse of justice yet again. Jacob Carter gripped the steering wheel, the hum of his engine a quiet companion on the dark, empty road. It was late, 11:47 p.m. The dashboard clock glowed, and the stars above shimmered like a silent applause for the evening he'd just spent with family. His cousin's birthday party had been a balm, laughter spilling over plates of warm food, the chatter of relatives weaving a cocoon of comfort around him. For a few hours, he'd shed the weight of his FBI badge, the relentless grind of his job, and let himself simply be a man who loved his people. The suit he'd worn all day felt stiff now, the tie loosened around his neck, and all he craved was the soft embrace of his couch back home. But beneath that calm, a flicker of unease stirred. Jacob knew the world too well, knew that even a badge couldn't shield him from the prejudice that shadowed his every step. As a black man, he'd felt it before. The sidelong glances, the tightened grips on purses, the stops that had no reason beyond the color of his skin. He shook his head, trying to banish the thought, but it clung like damp air. One wrong moment, one stranger in the dark, and everything could unravel. The yellow glow of streetlights bathed the quiet neighborhood in a hazy warmth, houses slumbering under the night sky. Then, without warning, red and blue lights erupted in his rearview mirror, slicing through the stillness like a blade. His heart sank, a weary ache blooming in his chest. "Here we go again," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He checked his speed. Fine. His lights? Working. His driving? Flawless. There was no cause, no justification, yet he knew exactly why this was happening. His hands tightened on the wheel, steady despite the storm brewing inside him. The officers behind him didn't know who he was. Not yet. They didn't see an FBI agent, a man who'd spent years upholding the law. They saw a target. And as the patrol car's siren wailed closer, Jacob braced himself for the confrontation ahead, his mind racing with the bitter truth. Justice was a fragile thing, and for men like him, it too often came with a fight. The words of his father looped endlessly in Jacob's mind, a steady rhythm of caution and survival drilled into him from childhood. Keep your hands visible, stay respectful, cooperate fully. Just make it home alive. That was the golden rule, the only thing that truly mattered. It didn't matter that he'd built a career for himself, that he'd earned respect in his field. No. When the world narrowed down to this moment, it all boiled down to the shade of his skin. Jacob's fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel as he eased his car to the shoulder of the deserted road, the glaring red and blue lights of the police cruiser pulsing behind him like a heartbeat in the dark. His chest felt heavy, a knot of dread forming as he braced himself for whatever lay ahead. He'd been trained to diffuse tension, to keep his cool under pressure, but now those skills seemed to slip through his fingers like sand, leaving him raw and exposed. "It's time," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the hum of his engine as the flickering lights painted the night sky in eerie, shifting hues. He kept his hands planted firmly at 10 and 2 on the wheel, stealing a quick glance in the rearview mirror. Two officers emerged from the patrol car, their silhouettes sharp against the glow of the headlights. They moved toward him with a deliberate swagger, exuding the kind of confidence that suggested they already believed they'd caught him red-handed. The first, Nathan Ellis, strode up to Jacob's window with the air of a man who'd seen it all and judged it guilty. Middle-aged, with a face carved by hard lines and a stare that could freeze water, Ellis adjusted his belt with a slow, practiced motion, his hand lingering near his holster. Jacob's stomach tightened. This wasn't a casual stop. This was a hunt. The second officer, Tom Scott, younger and less assured, took his place on the passenger side, his posture stiff, his eyes darting as if awaiting a cue from his partner. Jacob shut his eyes for a fleeting second, drawing a deep, steadying breath to anchor himself as the moment closed in. The soft whir of the window rolling down broke the silence as Ellis's flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, stabbing directly into Jacob's eyes. He flinched, momentarily blinded, but kept his composure. License and registration, Ellis barked, his voice a cold, unyielding blade, stripped of any warmth or pretense of civility. Jacob nodded, his movements slow and deliberate, telegraphing every action to avoid sparking trouble. His heart thudded against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat he fought to ignore as he reached for his wallet. He slid out his driver's license with care, then leaned toward the glove compartment, retrieving the registration papers with the same measured precision. "Here you go, officer," he said, his tone steady despite the storm brewing inside him, a mix of fear and simmering anger he dared not let surface. Ellis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he fixed Jacob with a long, probing stare, then let his gaze drift to the sleek lines of the car. A nice car. Too nice, his expression seemed to say. "This your car?" he asked, the words dripping with skepticism, laced with a sneer that suggested a black man behind the wheel of anything decent was a crime in itself. Jacob felt a flare of irritation ignite in his chest, a familiar sting he'd learned to smother time and time again. "Yes, this is my car," he replied, keeping his voice even as he handed over the documents, his face a mask of calm despite the insult gnawing at him. Ellis barely glanced at the paperwork, his eyes snapping back to Jacob as if hunting for some hidden flaw, some excuse to pounce. "Where you coming from this late?" he pressed, his tone thick with accusation, as though the mere act of driving at night was a confession of guilt. Jacob inhaled deeply, forcing the frustration down. "I'm coming from a family birthday party," he said, his words clipped but calm. Ellis's lips twisted into a mocking grin, his eyes narrowing. "Birthday, huh? Why so late?" He leaned closer, peering into the car's interior, searching for anything. A crumpled beer can, a stray wrapper, that might justify his suspicions. Finding nothing, he didn't relent. His demeanor only grew sharper, more predatory. "Yes, a birthday," Jacob repeated, the edge of exasperation creeping into his voice despite his efforts to suppress it. "I don't see a problem with that." On the passenger side, Scott tapped lightly on the window, his knuckles rapping against the glass. Jacob turned, pressing the button to lower it, and met the younger officer's uncertain gaze. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, professionalism still holding firm, though the tension coiled tighter within him, a spring ready to snap. Before Scott could answer, Ellis cut in, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. "Step out of the car!" Jacob's head jerked up, surprise flashing across his face at the sudden escalation. "Officer, I've complied with everything you've asked," he said, his tone firm but measured. "I'd like to understand the reason for this." Ellis wasn't having it. "I said step out of the car," he snapped, his hand hovering near his gun, his eyes glinting with a dangerous edge. The air thickened with menace, the kind of charged silence Jacob had always dreaded, a situation teetering on the brink where one wrong move could tip it into chaos. As an FBI agent, he knew the playbook. Compliance could save him, but resistance, even the slightest hint of it, could be twisted into a death sentence. Slowly, he unlatched the door and stepped out, the gravel crunching under his shoes as he raised his hands slightly, palms open, a clear signal of surrender. The night air bit at his skin, sharp and cold, but it was the heat of Ellis's scrutiny that burned hottest. The officer stepped closer, his presence suffocating, his eyes daring Jacob to flinch. "You carrying any weapons?" he demanded, his voice a low growl of suspicion. Jacob held his ground, every word calculated. "No, officer, I don't have any weapons. I'm an FBI agent. My ID's in the glove compartment." Ellis scoffed, a harsh, grating laugh spilling from his lips. "FBI, huh? That's a new one. I've heard every excuse in the book, but you think flashing that title gets you a free pass?" He turned to Scott with a smirk, seeking an audience for his disdain. "You hear that, Scott? This guy says he's FBI." Scott didn't laugh. He stood there, silent, his hand resting near his own weapon, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Jacob caught it, the hesitation, the unease, but Scott's loyalty to his partner outweighed any impulse to question him. That silence, that complicity only tightened the knot in Jacob's gut. The tension hung heavy, a taut wire stretched to its limit. Jacob had faced down threats before, stared into the eyes of danger. But this was different. This was a slow, deliberate unraveling, a power play he couldn't outmaneuver. "I've complied with all your requests," he said, his voice steady despite the anxiety clawing at him. "If you want to check my FBI badge, it's in the glove compartment." Ellis's sneer deepened, and he closed the gap between them, his breath hot and bitter with the scent of stale coffee. "I don't give a damn about your so-called badge," he spat, his words dripping with contempt. "You think that means anything here? I'm the one calling the shots." Jacob's pulse quickened, a surge of adrenaline flooding his veins. This wasn't just about authority. Ellis was baiting him, pushing him toward a breaking point. But Jacob refused to bite. His eyes flicked to Scott again, who stood frozen, a bystander to the storm brewing before him. "Pop the trunk," Ellis ordered, his voice a hard, unyielding command. Jacob frowned, a flicker of defiance stirring. "Officer, I don't think that's necessary. There's nothing illegal in my car." Before he could finish, Ellis lunged, seizing Jacob's arm and slamming him against the vehicle. The metal edge bit into his side, his shirt tearing at the shoulder, exposing his chest to the frigid night air. Pain flared, sharp and sudden, but Jacob bit back any reaction, knowing resistance could be fatal. "Trying to be smart, huh?" Ellis shouted, his control fraying as he pressed Jacob harder against the car. "You think I don't have the right to search this?" Scott watched from the sidelines, his eyes wide with confusion, caught between fear of his partner and the chaos unfolding. He didn't step in, didn't speak, just let it happen, his silence a tacit approval that fueled the fire. Jacob's breaths came slow and deep, a lifeline to his calm. "I'm not resisting," he said, low and firm. "I just want everything to go by the book." Ellis ignored him, spinning back to the car and tearing into it with reckless abandon, tossing aside anything in his path. Jacob stood helpless, the cold seeping into his bones where his torn shirt hung open, the humiliation sinking deeper than the chill. This wasn't about evidence or procedure. It was a violation, a stripping away of his dignity under the guise of justice. As Ellis rummaged, a dark realization settled over Jacob. This was spiraling beyond reason, beyond his control. The threat wasn't just to his pride or his possessions. It was to his life. The night stretched on, the roadside a stark stage for this quiet tragedy. Jacob's mind raced, replaying his father's lessons, the bitter truth of them laid bare. Justice, he realized, was a fragile thing, easily warped by those who wielded power without restraint. Ellis's actions weren't just a personal attack. They were a lesson in the consequences of unchecked authority, a warning etched into the fabric of this encounter. And as Scott stood by, complicit in his inaction, Jacob saw the deeper wound, the failure of those who could stop injustice but chose silence instead. The cold bit harder, the fear burned brighter, and Jacob stood still, a man caught in the crosshairs of a system that too often forgot its own principles. The night stretched endlessly before Jacob, the air biting at his skin as the situation unraveled into something dark and unpredictable. Agent Ellis stood mere feet away, his presence looming like a storm cloud ready to break. His voice cut through the stillness, sharp and mocking, as he spat out the word orders with a venomous edge. His eyes gleamed with menace, a dangerous spark flickering in their depths as he stared down Jacob. "You think you can tell me what to do?" he sneered, his lips curling into a cruel smirk. "This isn't your little sandbox to play in." Jacob inhaled deeply, the cold air filling his lungs as he fought to keep his composure. His muscles tightened instinctively, a ripple of tension coursing through his body. He recognized the kind of man Ellis was, volatile, reckless, the sort who thrived on chaos and needed only the faintest excuse to ignite a firestorm. Jacob hadn't done anything wrong, not by any stretch of the law he'd sworn to uphold, but to Ellis, his very existence seemed to be an affront, a challenge to his unchecked authority. "I'm not giving you orders," Jacob replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. His gaze locked onto Ellis's, unwavering. "I just want this handled the right way, by the book, no shortcuts, no mistakes." But his words, calm and measured as they were, only seemed to stoke the flames of Ellis's rage. The officer's sneer widened, his face twisting with contempt as he spun toward his partner, Scott, who lingered nervously a few steps away. "You hear that?" Ellis bellowed, his voice dripping with mockery. "This guy thinks he's untouchable just because he's FBI." He whirled back to Jacob, his tone darkening into something sinister. "No badge is getting you out of this tonight." The words hung heavy in the air, a promise of escalation that sent a shiver down Jacob's spine. This wasn't a routine stop anymore. Ellis wasn't just suspicious. He was hungry for a fight, itching to twist this encounter into something violent to justify his aggression. Ellis took a step closer, closing the distance between them until the tension was a living thing, crackling in the space that separated them. Jacob could feel the heat of the man's anger, the barely restrained urge to lash out. "I gave you a chance to prove yourself," Ellis hissed, his hand hovering near his holster, fingers twitching as if eager to draw his weapon. "But that's done now. I'm finding the truth my way." His voice was low, almost a growl, and Jacob's heart thudded in his chest. He'd faced danger before, countless times in his career, but never like this. Never at the hands of a fellow officer who held the reins of power with such reckless abandon. He knew the precipice they stood on, the thin line between control and chaos, and he chose silence over provocation. Any word, any movement, could tip the scales toward disaster. Nearby, Scott finally broke his silence, his voice trembling as it cut through the frigid night air. "Dan, that's enough," he said, though his words lacked conviction, swallowed by the wind and the weight of Ellis's fury. "He's done everything we asked. We've got nothing on him. Let's just check his badge and call it a night." But Ellis didn't even glance at his partner. "Shut up, Scott," he snapped, his tone sharp enough to slice through steel. "You don't call the shots here." His eyes flashed as he glared at Scott, who shrank under the weight of that stare, his shoulders slumping. Jacob caught the flicker of conflict in Scott's expression. A young officer caught in a moral tug-of-war, torn between what was right and the fear of defying the man beside him. Scott knew this was wrong. It was written in the way his jaw tightened, the way his gaze darted away from Ellis's. But his fear kept him mute, a silent accomplice to the unfolding nightmare. Ellis turned his attention back to Jacob, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure threat. "Step behind the car," he ordered, his voice thick with authority, leaving no room for argument. "I'm searching you, every inch, until I figure out what you're hiding." Jacob hesitated, his mind racing. He knew compliance was his only path to de-escalation, but the thought of standing there, exposed and humiliated on the side of a deserted road, gnawed at his pride. His shirt was already torn from an earlier shove, the fabric hanging in ragged strips. And now this, a full search in the dead of night. It was an insult, a degradation he didn't deserve after following every rule. "I've got nothing to hide," he said, his voice still calm but edged with a quiet strength. "I've cooperated from the start. If you need more, my badge is in the car. Go check it yourself." Check. Ellis's response was swift and brutal. With a cold, calculating glare, he lunged forward and slammed Jacob against the car, the force driving the breath from his lungs. Pain exploded through Jacob's back and shoulders as the metal dug into his spine, sharp and unyielding. Ellis's eyes lit up with a sick satisfaction, as if this moment of dominance was what he'd been craving all along. Jacob's mind raced, a single thought cutting through the haze of pain. If this kept spiraling, it could end in catastrophe. Ellis's aggression was a wildfire, and Scott's reluctance only fanned the flames. The situation was slipping beyond reason, teetering on the edge of something Jacob might not walk away from. "Hold him steady!" Ellis barked at Scott, his voice slicing through the night as he turned toward the car. "I'm tearing this thing apart until I find something." Scott hesitated, his eyes darting between Jacob and Ellis, his face a mask of indecision. He was younger than Ellis, softer around the edges, with a nervous energy that betrayed his unease. Jacob could see the war raging inside him, duty clashing with conscience, fear wrestling with guilt. Slowly, Scott stepped closer, his hand settling on Jacob's shoulder in a grip so light it felt more like an apology than restraint.
Jacob met his gaze, searching for some sign of resistance, some spark of courage. There was none, just a quiet, helpless resignation that deepened the pit in Jacob's stomach. Scott's silence was a betrayal, not of malice, but of weakness, and it fueled the chaos Ellis was unleashing. As Ellis rummaged through the car, his movements grew frantic, violent. Papers fluttered to the ground, personal items scattered across the pavement. Innocent belongings turned into debris by his relentless search. Jacob stood there, the cold seeping into his bones, the humiliation burning hotter with every passing second. He was no criminal, no threat, yet here he was, stripped of dignity by a man who wielded power like a blunt weapon. The injustice of it clawed at him, but he forced himself to stay calm, to hold on to the thread of control that kept him from snapping back. He knew the stakes. Ellis was looking for a fight, and any retaliation would give him the excuse he craved. Scott's grip on his shoulder wavered, his fingers loosening as if he couldn't bear to play his part in this charade. Jacob turned his head slightly, catching Scott's eye for a fleeting moment. In that brief exchange, he saw a glimmer of regret, a silent plea for forgiveness that Scott couldn't voice. The young officer's face was pale, his brow furrowed with the weight of what he wasn't stopping. He wanted to intervene. Jacob could feel it. But the shadow of Ellis's authority held him captive, a prisoner to his own cowardice. Ellis emerged from the car empty-handed, his frustration boiling over into something feral. "There's nothing here," he muttered, his voice tight with barely contained rage. He clutched a handful of papers, case notes, a grocery list, then flung them aside as if their innocence mocked him. His search wasn't about evidence. It was about power, about bending Jacob to his will. In a sudden, unhinged burst of fury, he stormed toward Jacob, his face contorted with aggression. "You think you're so clever hiding it all?" he shouted, grabbing the remnants of Jacob's torn shirt and ripping it clean off. The fabric gave way with a harsh tear, leaving Jacob bare-chested in the biting wind, vulnerable and exposed. It wasn't just an assault on his body, it was a deliberate stripping of his humanity, a lesson in submission delivered with savage glee. "I've got nothing to hide," Jacob repeated, his voice a lifeline of calm amid the chaos. Inside, anger surged, a roaring tide threatening to break free, but he clamped it down. Losing control would only feed Ellis's madness. The officer ignored him, turning to Scott with a dark, mocking laugh. "You see this? These types always think they're smarter than us, slinking around with their secrets." Scott didn't laugh. He stood frozen, his face a portrait of discomfort, his whispered protest barely audible. "Dan, that's enough. He's clean. Let it go." His voice shook, a fragile thread of defiance that snapped when Ellis wheeled on him. "Shut up, Scott! Who do you think you are?" Ellis roared, his shout echoing down the empty street. Jacob watched the exchange, the pieces falling into place. Scott wasn't just scared. He was terrified, not only of Ellis, but of the line they were crossing. His eyes met Jacob's again, and in that moment Jacob saw the depth of his turmoil. A man drowning in the consequences of his own inaction. Ellis, meanwhile, was a force of nature, his fury building toward an inevitable explosion. The air thickened with the promise of violence, and Jacob knew he had to act before the situation slipped beyond salvation. Fighting back wasn't an option. It would only escalate the madness, but he needed a way out, a lifeline to pull them back from the brink. Just then, a car rolled by, its headlights piercing the darkness as it slowed to a crawl. Jacob's pulse quickened. Someone else, a witness, a chance. Ellis spun toward it, his face twisted with rage. "Get out of here!" he screamed, his voice raw with frustration. The car didn't stop, but its presence shifted something in the air, a momentary pause in Ellis's rampage. Jacob seized the opening, drawing a steadying breath. "Officer," he said, his tone deliberate and firm, "I've cooperated fully. If you need confirmation, call someone higher up. I just want this done right, by procedure." Ellis turned back, his eyes blazing, but there was a flicker of uncertainty now, a crack in his armor. The mention of authority, someone above him, seemed to pierce through his bravado, if only for a second. Jacob held his ground, shirtless and shivering, but unbroken. This wasn't just a standoff anymore. It was a lesson in justice, a stark reminder of what happens when power is wielded without restraint. Ellis's actions would have consequences, whether he saw them now or not, and Jacob vowed to see this through, not for revenge, but for the principle that no one, not even a man with a badge, stood above the law. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, the night air hung heavy with tension, thick enough to choke on. Ellis, a man whose badge had long since become a shield for his ego, stood with his chest puffed out, his authority teetering on the edge of something dangerous. He didn't want this to spiral so far that his superiors, or anyone else who might question him, would take notice. His power was a fragile thing, a house of cards he'd built over years, and the last thing he needed was someone poking holes in it. Every muscle in his body was taut, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might shatter. He could feel the heat of his own fury rising, a wildfire he barely kept at bay, and he wasn't about to let this moment undo everything he'd claimed for himself. Beside him, Scott lingered near Jacob, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Fear painted in the wideness of his eyes, confusion etched in the furrow of his brow. He couldn't bring himself to meet Jacob's gaze anymore, as if doing so would force him to confront the ugliness unfolding before him. The air between them crackled with unease, and Scott's hands fidgeted nervously at his sides. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, trembled with a desperate plea. "Dan, call for backup. We don't need to push this any further," he said, his words spilling out like a man begging for a lifeline. He wasn't just scared for Jacob, he was scared for himself, for what he might become if he let this go on. Ellis sucked in a deep breath, the sound sharp and ragged, then turned his back on Jacob as if the sight of him was too much to bear. His fists balled up tight, knuckles whitening under the strain, and for a fleeting moment he stood frozen, wrestling with the storm inside him. The anger wasn't just about Jacob, it never had been. It was about control, about the way Ellis saw the world bending to his will, and how every challenge to that felt like a personal betrayal. With a low growl that rumbled from deep in his chest, he snapped at Scott. "Fine, call them." But the words weren't a surrender, they dripped with bitterness, a dare disguised as permission. Scott fumbled with his phone, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline as he dialed the station. His breaths came in shallow bursts, and he kept his eyes fixed on the screen, avoiding the weight of Ellis's glare. Meanwhile, Jacob stood rooted to the spot, his own chest rising and falling with deliberate calm. The tension in the air softened just a fraction, like a string pulled too tight finally given a moment's slack. But he wasn't naive. Ellis wasn't the type to let go so easily. To him, this wasn't just a scuffle in the street. It was a battle for dominance, a test of who would break first. Jacob could feel it in the way Ellis's presence loomed, even with his back turned. Ellis took a few steps away, his boots scuffing against the cracked pavement as he tried to cool the rage simmering in his veins. But it didn't work. His eyes still burned with it, twin embers glowing in the dark. He wasn't a man who backed down when he felt his grip slipping, and Scott's hesitation only fanned the flames higher. To Ellis, it wasn't just defiance from Jacob. It was betrayal from Scott, a crack in the loyalty he demanded from those around him. "Fine," he sneered, spinning back to face Jacob, his voice thick with disdain. "Let's see who comes to settle this." His gaze locked onto Jacob, sharp and venomous, a promise that this wasn't over. "But don't think this ends smoothly. I'll find something on you." Jacob inhaled deeply, forcing his racing heart to steady. Time stretched thin, each second ticking by like the slow drip of water in a quiet room. He knew backup was coming. Sirens would pierce the night soon enough. But with Ellis, a single spark could ignite a disaster. The man's stare was unrelenting, predatory, as if Jacob were prey he'd cornered and refused to release. Ellis stepped closer again, not with fists this time, but with a look that carried years of festering resentment. "You think you're something, don't you?" he hissed, his voice low and cutting. "An FBI agent, but tonight you're just a black guy standing in the street with no one to save you." Each word was a blade, sharpened to wound Jacob's pride.
to bait him into a reaction that would justify Ellis's wrath. Jacob felt the sting of every syllable, the weight of Ellis's hatred pressing down on him like a physical force. The night sky stretched endlessly above, stars swallowed by city lights, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. But he wouldn't bite. Not yet. He knew Ellis wanted a fight, a reason to escalate, and Jacob refused to give it to him. His silence was his shield, his stillness a defiance of its own. Then Scott's voice cut through the haze, shaky but resolute. "Dan, stop!" His eyes darted between Jacob and Ellis, wide with a mix of dread and determination. "He's been cooperative from the start. We've got no reason to keep this going." It was a plea, but there was an edge to it, a flicker of courage breaking through his fear. Ellis whipped around, his face contorted with fury. "You're taking his side, Scott!" he roared, his voice bouncing off the empty street. "Do you even know what's happening here? This isn't about cooperation, it's about power." His shout shattered the stillness, a thunderclap of rage that seemed to shake the ground beneath them. Jacob watched in silence, sensing the tipping point drawing near. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was Ellis versus Scott, a clash of wills fueled by one man's tyranny and another's awakening conscience. Scott didn't shrink back this time, though his face paled under the strain. "We're cops, Dan," he said, his voice gaining strength with every word. "We're supposed to serve justice, not twist it to feed our anger or ego." He stood taller now, his decision made. He wouldn't stay silent any longer. Ellis froze, his expression hardening into something unreadable, his dark eyes boring into Scott. Those words had hit him like a punch, cracking the armor of his self-righteousness. For Jacob, the moment hung in fragile balance. He could see it in Ellis's stance, in the way his shoulders tensed. Either he'd back off or he'd erupt, dragging them all into chaos. And then, as if fate had flipped a coin, the worst unfolded. Ellis lunged, his control snapping like a frayed rope. His hands seized Jacob's throat, slamming him against the car with a force that sent a jolt of pain through his spine. The metal groaned under the impact, the sound sharp and jarring, and a faint metallic tang of blood tinged the air as Jacob's lips split against his teeth. "Stop, Dan! You've gone too far!" Scott's scream pierced the night, raw with panic, but Ellis was beyond hearing. His eyes were wild, pupils blown wide with a fury that had consumed him entirely. He was a man possessed, intent on breaking Jacob, not for any crime, but for daring to exist in his path. Jacob's body ached, his strength waning under the assault, but he wouldn't fight back, not with fists. Instead, he dug deep, anchoring himself with every ounce of will he had left, refusing to let Ellis win completely. The distant wail of sirens grew louder, a lifeline threading through the chaos, but Jacob wasn't sure it would reach him in time. Ellis's grip tightened, his breath hot and ragged against Jacob's face. Then Scott acted, shoving Ellis with a desperate strength. He yelled, "You have to stop! You're going to kill him!" His voice cracked with fear and regret, a man watching his world unravel. Ellis stumbled back, chest heaving, his bloodshot eyes glaring at Scott. For a heartbeat, they stood locked in a standoff, the air electric with uncertainty. Jacob gasped, dragging air into his burning lungs, struggling to stand as the sirens closed in. Ellis's gaze flickered, awareness creeping in. He knew he was running out of time. Slowly he stepped back, his hands unclenching, but the tension didn't break. It lingered, heavy and suffocating. Jacob's body throbbed, the pain radiating from his back where the car had bitten into him, but it paled against the fire in his mind. He couldn't crumble, not now. This wasn't just about surviving Ellis's attack. It was about exposing the rot beneath his power, the injustice he wielded like a weapon. "Dan, what are you doing?" Scott's shout was frantic now, his voice trembling as he planted himself between them, a shaky barrier against Ellis's wrath. His eyes, brimming with guilt, flicked to Jacob with a silent apology. "We have to stop this, Dan. We've gone too far." Ellis took a shuddering breath, his frame rigid with barely contained rage. He wasn't an officer anymore. He was a man unmoored, driven by pride and prejudice that had festered too long. "Too far?" he spat, turning on Scott with a snarl. "Can't you see we're in control here? He's just a liar, and if you're not with me, you're no better than him." His words were a lash meant to wound, but Scott flinched only slightly, his resolve hardening. Jacob watched, his breath still uneven, and saw the shift in Scott's eyes, a man wrestling with his own soul. "Scott," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "You know this is wrong. You can end this before it's too late. I just want it to stop, the right way." His words weren't a plea. They were a call to reason, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Scott met his gaze and something broke inside him, a dam of doubt and shame giving way. He turned to Ellis, his voice quivering but firm. "Dan, this has to stop. You can't keep doing this. If you don't, I'll report everything." He didn't look away this time, his stare meeting Ellis's head-on. Ellis's face flushed crimson, fury twisting his features. "Are you crazy, Scott? You're turning on me for him?" His shout was a bellow, each word a hammer strike, but Scott held his ground. "It's not for him, Dan. It's for what's right. We're police. We have to do the right thing." Sweat beaded on Ellis's forehead, his eyes darting with a mix of panic and disbelief. His control was slipping, the truth clawing its way out despite his resistance. And then, in a final surge of madness, he ripped his gun from its holster, leveling it at Jacob with a trembling hand. "You're not getting away with this," he snarled, his voice unhinged. Scott lunged forward, desperation driving him, but Ellis shoved him aside with a wild swing. "Stop! You don't know what you're—" The story paused there, but the lesson lingered like smoke in the air. Justice wasn't Ellis's to twist. It was a fragile thread, easily frayed by those who abused their power. His downfall wasn't just in the gun he held, but in the choices that led him there, a stark reminder that unchecked authority could rot into tyranny. For Jacob, survival meant more than enduring the night. It meant standing tall against the weight of prejudice, proving that resilience could outlast rage. And for Scott, it was a reckoning, a chance to reclaim the honor his badge was meant to carry. The consequences of power, wielded without conscience, echoed louder than any siren in the distance. In the thick of the night, Dan Scott's voice ripped through the air, a desperate shout that seemed to dissolve into the wind. "Ellis, stop!" he bellowed, but his words fell on deaf ears. Jacob Carter stood motionless, his chest heaving as his heart thundered against his ribcage. In that fleeting, fragile moment, he could feel the razor-thin boundary separating life from death, a line so delicate it might snap with a single breath. His hand quivered ever so slightly, betraying the storm of fear and adrenaline surging within him, yet his eyes remained locked on Ellis, unwavering, resolute. "You don't have to do this, Dan," Jacob said, his voice cutting through the chaos with an eerie calm that surprised even himself. "We can stop this now, the right way. Don't let it spiral any further." His plea hung in the air, heavy with the weight of hope, but Ellis's gaze offered no hint of surrender. The man's fingers tightened around the gun, his knuckles whitening as if the cold steel were his last tether to the power he'd lost in this spiraling confrontation. The distant wail of police sirens grew louder, a haunting chorus that mingled with the flickering red and blue lights now bouncing off the wet asphalt. Help was coming, backup was close, but would it arrive in time to halt the tragedy teetering on the edge of reality? Scott, still reeling from being shoved to the ground by Ellis, dragged himself up slightly, his voice cracking with desperation as he made one final plea. "Dan, think about this. This isn't how it ends. Pull that trigger, and there's no undoing it. No way back." His words trembled with urgency, his breath ragged as he clutched at the faint hope of reaching his colleague. Ellis, however, stood like a statue carved from rage, the gun still trained on Jacob. His eyes burned with a chaotic fury, a wildfire of emotion that refused to be tamed. Jacob, despite the barrel staring him down, held his ground. He could sense the fragility of the moment, one twitch, one misstep, and everything could erupt into irreversible ruin. Time itself seemed to stretch, each second crawling by as the sirens swelled, now mere heartbeats away from breaking onto the scene. Would Ellis press forward on this dark path he'd carved out, or could he still glimpse the abyss he was tumbling toward? Jacob felt the tension coil tighter in the air, a suffocating pressure that made every breath feel like a battle. Ellis's face twisted with uncontrollable wrath, his hands trembling yet still clutching the weapon with a death grip. The headlights of the nearing police cars sliced through the darkness, casting stark shadows across the trio and amplifying the danger. Jacob's mind raced. He knew the arrival of more officers could tip this standoff into chaos beyond anyone's grasp. One wrong move, one spark, and bullets would fly. "Dan, you're not this person," Scott said, his tone softening despite the strain, a quiet plea woven into his words. He stayed low, his palms pressed against the gritty pavement, his eyes fixed on Ellis with a flicker of belief that the man he once knew might still be reachable. "We screwed up, I get it, but you can stop this before it's too late." Ellis's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, his hands shaking as he gripped the gun even tighter. His gaze darted wildly between Scott, sprawled on the ground, and Jacob, standing tall despite the threat. In that split second, Jacob caught it. A fleeting glimmer of doubt in Ellis's stormy eyes, a tiny crack in the wall of rage where reason still fought to break through. But was it enough?
"You don't get it, Scott,"
Ellis rasped, his voice raw and jagged, as if the words were choking him.
"He thinks he's better than us, better than me. I can't let that stand."
His accusation hung heavy, dripping with bitterness, but Jacob didn't flinch. The gun was aimed square at his chest now, a cold promise of finality just a trigger pull away. Fear clawed at his insides, rising like bile, yet he refused to let it rule him. His voice, steady as stone, became his shield. "Ellis," Jacob said, firm but measured, "you don't have to do this. I know you're furious, but ending my life won't fix anything. Deep down, you know that." Ellis stared back, his eyes still blazing, though the fire wavered, flickering like a candle caught in a draft. The gun didn't drop, but his grip softened, his hands no longer locked in that iron resolve. The sirens were deafening now, their shrill cry bouncing off the buildings as the flashing lights bathed them all in a surreal glow. The tension peaked, a tightrope stretched to its breaking point, as police cars roared around the corner, tires squealing against the pavement. Their beams flooded the scene, turning it into a stark tableau where life and death danced on a knife's edge. Suddenly, a cruiser skidded to a stop, its door flying open as two officers leaped out, weapons drawn in an instant. "Drop it!" one of them barked, their voice slicing through the night like a blade. Ellis flinched, his head whipping toward the newcomers, the chaos in his mind swelling as the walls closed in. His eyes darted. Scott, Jacob, the officers, like a cornered beast with nowhere left to run. "Put the gun down, Ellis!" the second officer shouted, their tone unyielding, a command wrapped in steel. "You're crossing a line! Don't make it worse!" Scott, still grounded, pushed himself up slightly, his voice raw with exhaustion and hope. "Listen to them, Dan. Stop this. We don't need a tragedy tonight. Let's end it here." Ellis froze, his wide eyes swimming with turmoil, the gun still raised but trembling violently in his grasp. He was trapped, teetering between defiance and defeat, his mind a battlefield of clashing impulses. The newly arrived officers stood firm, their weapons locked on him, fingers hovering over triggers, ready to act if he so much as twitched. Jacob saw his chance, a narrow window to pull them all back from the brink. He inhaled deeply, his voice cutting through the clamor with quiet strength. "Ellis, just lower the gun. Everyone's watching. You don't have to keep going down this road." Ellis's gaze locked onto Jacob's, hollow and lost, as if the world around him had dissolved into a haze. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat, his voice thick with venom, but the fight seemed to drain from him. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his lips, and slowly, so slowly, the gun began to dip. Relief rippled through the air, tentative and fragile, though no one dared relax fully. The weapon still dangled in his hand, a latent threat that could reignite the nightmare with one reckless move. The officers held their ground, barrels trained on Ellis, their faces taut with focus. Then, at last, the gun slipped from his fingers, clattering against the pavement with a hollow, final thud that echoed in the stillness. A collective exhale swept the scene. Jacob's knees nearly buckled, but he stood firm, his breath shallow as the weight of survival settled over him. Ellis's head dropped, his shoulders sagging as if every ounce of strength had bled out of him. His arms hung limp, lifeless at his sides, a man unmade by his own choices. Scott scrambled forward, snapping handcuffs around Ellis's wrists with swift, practiced motions, his silence speaking louder than any words. The rage was gone, the justifications spent. Ellis was nothing now but a shell, defeated and hollow. The officers moved in, hauling him to his feet with firm grips, guiding him toward the waiting patrol car as others fanned out to secure the area. Jacob remained rooted in place, his legs locked as if the ground might swallow him whole. Inside, a tempest churned, relief that he'd survived, pain from the betrayal, and a slow-burning anger at the injustice that had brought them here. Scott approached, his steps hesitant, his eyes shadowed with regret.
"I'm sorry, Jacob," he murmured, his voice fracturing under the weight of guilt. "I didn't think it'd go this far."
Jacob met his gaze but said nothing. Words felt useless. Scott's apology couldn't erase the night's scars, couldn't rewind the clock. Yet in those final moments, Scott had chosen to act, to speak, and that choice might have been the thread that kept Jacob alive. The scene began to settle, the chaos giving way to procedure as Ellis, now cuffed, was led to the cruiser. His posture crumpled, his head bowed low, as if the burden of his actions, regret, failure, the loss of everything he'd once held dear, had crushed him entirely. Jacob watched as Ellis vanished behind the car door, the slam of it shutting like a punctuation mark on the ordeal. But the relief was incomplete, a half-formed thing overshadowed by the weight of what he'd endured. The shouts, the threats, the cold press of mortality as the gun hovered inches from his chest. It was a wound carved into his mind, one that time wouldn't easily mend. Scott lingered nearby, his silence heavy with remorse. Jacob could feel the man's guilt radiating off him, a palpable thing, and he understood that Scott's earlier inaction had fueled this descent. It was a quiet complicity, born of fear or hesitation, that had let the situation fester until it exploded. The other officers bustled around them, taking statements, cordoning off the area, their voices a dull hum against the ringing in Jacob's ears. He felt like a man standing in the aftermath of a hurricane. Alive, yes, but surrounded by wreckage. The scars weren't just the bruises blooming across his skin. They were deeper, etched into his soul by the stark realization of the prejudice he'd faced. An officer approached, his tone markedly gentler than earlier in the night. "Mr. Carter, we'll need you at the station for a full report. Do you need any help getting there?" Jacob shook his head, drawing a steadying breath. "I'll drive myself."
Thank you.
The courtesy felt sincere, but Jacob clung to the scraps of autonomy he had left. Too much had been stripped from him tonight. His safety, his trust, his faith in the system he'd sworn to uphold. As he walked to his car, its interior torn apart, a casualty of the night's frenzy, the other officers cast sidelong glances his way. They knew this wasn't a mess that could be quietly buried. Jacob wasn't just anyone. He was an FBI agent, and this clash would ripple far beyond this street, sparking investigations and consequences. Ellis and Scott would face justice, but that wouldn't erase the hollow ache of betrayal and inequity gnawing at Jacob's core. Sliding into the driver's seat, he paused, his hands trembling faintly as they gripped the wheel. This hadn't been just a random clash, it was a brutal lesson in the fragility of fairness. A reminder that even as an agent of the law, his skin color marked him as a target in ways no badge could shield. He turned the key, the engine rumbling to life, and pulled away from the scene. Streetlights stretched long shadows across the road, the darkness softening as dawn's first whispers crept into the sky. Inside, Jacob wrestled with a maelstrom, rage at the betrayal, sorrow for the trust shattered, and a quiet relief that he'd emerged breathing. His life had shifted irrevocably. This night would stand as a jagged milestone, a testament to the truth that justice could be a fickle, flawed thing. Yet he refused to let it end there. With the evidence he'd gathered and the backing of his FBI colleagues, he'd ensure Ellis faced the reckoning he deserved. More than that, he'd fight to reshape the system from within, a system that had failed him, that failed so many like him. As he drove through the deserted streets, the weight of his survival crystallized into something more. He wasn't just a victim, but a beacon of defiance. This wasn't his battle alone. It was the struggle of countless others, judged and diminished for the hue of their skin. Jacob Carter wouldn't rest until true equity was carved out of the ashes of this night. The road ahead was long, fraught with pain and resistance, but he'd reclaimed something invaluable: his right to live, to stand, to demand better. His story pulsed with a raw, unyielding truth. Injustice could strike anyone, anywhere, but the fight for what's right must never falter. Through the lens of his ordeal shone a piercing lesson: abusing power as Ellis had brought only ruin, while courage and perseverance could light the way to a world where justice wasn't just a word, but a reality for all.